On the first Thursday, Grace Larkin did not cross the pasture. She baked the bread anyway. She kneaded the dough before sunrise, worked a thumb of butter into the crust, and set the loaf near the open window to cool. For 3 years, that smell had meant she would wrap the bread in a clean towel, add coffee or preserves, and walk the worn path to Samuel Pike's house before noon. Today she folded the towel and placed the loaf inside a traveling crate, across the pasture. Samuel opened his kitchen door. Even at that distance, Grace knew the shape of his Thursday ritual. He would sweep the porch with 2 slow strokes, carry out the blue cup he used every morning, then bring a second cup from the cupboard as if it had appeared there by accident. He never asked her to come. He only made room after she arrived. Grace watched him set both cups on the table. 11 days. Her uncle Ezra called from the barn. "If we mean to meet the Denver train, we cannot leave the packing until Sunday." Grace stepped away from the window. Ezra Larkin had arrived from Kansas the previous evening with a dust-gray coat, a tired horse, and a proposal written more carefully than any letter he had ever sent her. His boarding house in Salina had grown from 6 rooms to 14. He needed someone who could control the accounts, preserve enough food for winter, and keep hired help from turning a busy kitchen into confusion. He had not asked Grace to assist him. He had asked her to manage it. On the barn floor, Ezra had arranged empty crates beside sacks of dried beans and flour. Grace knelt by his supply list, ran one finger down the freight figures, then reached for the pencil tucked into her hair. "You counted the Denver charge twice," she said. Ezra bent over the page. "Where?" "Here, when the goods leave Colorado, and here again under rail expenses." She crossed out the second figure, recalculated the column, and wrote the savings beneath it. Ezra let out a low whistle. "That mistake nearly cost me $43. It would have cost more by winter. You ordered lamp oil by the case, but priced it by the gallon." He looked from the corrected list to her face. "Grace, I am not offering charity." "I know." It was the same answer she had given Samuel whenever he said she did not have to bring anything. With Ezra, the words felt different. He had named the work, the responsibility, and the place he wanted her to occupy. A breeze carried the smell of cooling bread through the barn. Grace looked toward the pasture despite herself. Samuel still sat beside 2 untouched cups. Ezra opened his leather case and removed a cream-colored rail ticket. One end bore the Denver stamp. The destination read Salina in square black letters. "The wagon leaves here Monday morning, 11 days from now," he said. "You can decide tonight." Grace wiped flour from her fingers before touching the ticket. It was lighter than the account book she carried each Thursday, and heavier than anything Samuel had ever asked of her. She returned to the house, opened the book at the page where Samuel's seed orders ended, and laid the ticket across his settled figures. Then she closed the cover. At noon, the second blue cup disappeared from Samuel's porch. The bread remained in the traveling crate. Grace carried the account book back to Ezra and placed it beside the corrected supply list. "I'll be ready Monday," she said. Beyond the open barn door, Samuel stood alone at the fence, looking down at the path she had not taken. His hand rested on the gate latch, but he did not lift it. 7 pencil marks crossed the margin of Grace's packing list before Thursday returned. The bread in Ezra's crate had gone hard enough to feed the chickens. 3 shelves in Grace's pantry stood bare, and 14 sealed jars waited in straw-lined boxes beneath the barn window. Each label showed its contents, the summer it was made, and which meals it could supply at the Salina boarding house. Grace lifted a crate onto the scale and watched the iron needle settle. 112 pounds, Ezra said. 109. The needle sits 3 pounds above zero. He crouched to inspect it, then adjusted the figure on his list. Grace moved 2 jars of tomatoes from the rear crate to the center box. She shifted lamp oil forward, placed flour above the axle, and drew a new wagon diagram in her account book. Ezra had wanted to load by room kitchen goods together, bedding together, tools behind them. Grace loaded by weight and by what they would need first if rain or a broken wheel stopped them on the road. "You have done this before," Ezra said. "I have watched men do it badly." He smiled, but Grace kept writing. 4 days remained before the wagon left for Denver. Work gave every hour a place. It kept her hands from measuring the distance between the barn and Samuel Pike's porch. Across the pasture, Samuel opened his flour bin and found enough white dust for half a biscuit. He tried mixing the flour with cornmeal, burned one side of the biscuit, and ate it standing at the sink. The empty chair remained where Grace had left it. The coffee tin held grounds too weak to brew twice. A seed invoice lay unanswered beside his stove, and the pencil Grace always sharpened had worn blunt against his figures. None of those things had appeared suddenly. He had simply never seen how often she prevented them from becoming problems. Thursday light reached the porch boards. Samuel carried out his blue cup, stopped in the doorway, and went back for the second. He placed it across from his own, then turned the handle toward the empty chair the way Grace preferred it. Near noon, a wagon sheet rose above her barn fence. Ezra pulled one edge tight while Grace fastened it over the stacked crates. She never looked toward Samuel's house. He waited until the coffee lost its steam. At Grace's barn, a rope slipped from Ezra's hands. One side of the canvas sagged, exposing the uneven line of boxes underneath. "The back will drag before we reach the county road," Grace said. She loosened the rear lashings, ordered the heaviest flour sacks moved over the axle, and used the preserve crates to fill the gaps that would otherwise let the load shift downhill. When Ezra tightened the canvas again, it lay level from front to back. "That should carry to Kansas," he said. "It should reach Denver. We inspect it again there." Ezra studied her for a moment. "You still have time to change your mind." Grace closed the brass catch on her account book. 4 days is time to finish. It is not time to begin waiting again. Samuel heard none of it. He carried both cups inside, poured the untouched coffee into the wash basin, and reached for the jar of peach preserves on the shelf. Grace had left it during her last visit, its gold cloth cover tied beneath the rim with white string. A thin ring of dust marked the wood around it. When Samuel lifted the jar, something pale remained on the shelf. It was a square of paper, folded once and pressed flat beneath the glass. He opened it with his work-roughened fingers. Grace had written only 6 words. "You always knew where I lived." Samuel read them until the light faded from the kitchen window. He set the note beside the jar, walked to the door, and looked across the pasture. A lamp burned in Grace's front room. Between the 2 houses lay 40 acres of grass, one low fence, and the path her boots had pressed into the ground over 3 years. He put on his hat. At the porch steps, he stopped. The lamp across the field went dark before his hand left the railing. Morning sunlight found the peach jar still unopened on his table. Grace was already seated at her desk. She laid Samuel's seed invoices beside the account book, checked each amount against the stubs he had brought her after market days, and drew a line beneath the final column. One payment remained due the following Thursday. She circled its date, copied the supplier's address onto the outside of an envelope, and placed his sharpened pencil inside with the papers. Ezra carried an empty trunk through the room. "You mean to settle his accounts before your own packing?" "They are settled." Grace closed the envelope. "This only returns what belongs to him." She did not say that the packet ended the last task Samuel might expect her to finish. She tied it with plain string, carried it toward the pasture, and stepped onto the path she had refused to take the previous Thursday. At the shared gate, she stopped. Samuel was coming from the other side. He carried no cup, no seed bill, and no reason she could name. The folded note showed above the pocket of his work shirt. For several seconds, neither of them touched the latch between them. Grace held out the packet. "Your seed account is balanced through August. The next payment is written on the front." Samuel accepted it without looking down. "I found your note. I expected you would. You put it under the jar. It was the one thing I knew you would reach for eventually." His fingers tightened around the envelope. "Are you going somewhere?" Grace glanced back as Ezra emerged from the house with her brown traveling trunk balanced against his hip. "Selena," she said, "my uncle has a boarding house there. For a visit. To manage it." Ezra lowered the trunk beside the barn, took a square depot label from his coat, and hammered 2 small tacks through its corners. The blows traveled clearly across the pasture. Denver Depot Monday had been printed across the card. Beneath it, Grace had written her name. Samuel looked from the label to her. "That is 3 days." "Yes. Kansas is a far piece." Grace rested one hand on the gate. The latch was worn smooth where her fingers had lifted it every Thursday. "So is this field," she said, "when only one person crosses it." Samuel lowered his eyes to the packet. You never said you wanted me to. I should not have needed to explain every kindness before you could answer one. The words held no anger. That made them harder to dismiss. Grace removed her hand from the latch and turned toward the barn. Behind her, metal clicked. She looked back, but Samuel had only opened the gate far enough to collect the envelope. He remained on his side. The gate swung shut between them. Grace joined Ezra at the wagon and checked the trunk straps. One buckle had cracked near the tongue. She replaced it with a shorter harness strap, threaded the leather twice through the ring, and tested it with both hands. That will hold past Denver, Ezra said. It only has to hold until we inspect it again. He gave her the hammer. Grace drove the last tack into the depot label herself. Across the field, Samuel stood beside his fence with her account packet under one arm and the folded note in his pocket. He could now see the destination, the day, and the trunk that would carry her away. Still, he did not lift the latch a second time. 2 mornings before the Denver journey, Ezra's loaded wagon leaned sharply toward its left rear wheel. Grace noticed the tilt when a jar rolled against the wall of its crate. She ordered Ezra to stop tightening the canvas, crawled beneath the wagon, and found a split running along the wooden brace above the axle. The brake had not opened completely, but the mountain road would finish it. Ezra set his hat on the ground. I can unload. We would still need a new brace. A hammer struck wood across the pasture. Grace looked up. Samuel stood beside his fence, repairing a rail that did not appear broken. His eyes were fixed on the wagon. She returned to the split. We have 2 days. Start unloading the rear quarter. Before Ezra moved the first crate, the gate latch lifted. Samuel crossed, carrying a length of seasoned ash, a draw knife, and an auger. He stopped several feet from Grace and studied the wagon without pretending he had come for another reason. Saw the wheel drop, he said. The brace split above it. I have ash enough. Grace touched the timber he carried. The grain ran straight, without knots. It was the piece a careful rancher saved because replacing it meant having nothing equal when his own wagon failed. We can pay you, Ezra said. Samuel looked at Grace. I did not come to sell it. She held his gaze, then stepped aside. The old brace comes out from the right. If you pull left, you will catch the brake rod. They worked beneath the wagon shoulder to shoulder. Samuel cut the damaged timber free while Grace supported the rod with a rope sling. She measured the replacement, marked the bolt holes, and corrected Samuel when his second mark sat a finger's width too low. You always did distrust my figures, he said. Only the ones you guessed. A brief smile passed over his face. Grace almost answered it before the weight shifted against the sling. Now, she said. Samuel drove the brace into place. Ezra lowered the wagon, and the bed settled level above all 4 wheels. He walked around it twice before nodding. I have hired married teams who could not work that cleanly. Neither Grace nor Samuel replied. Grace brushed wood shavings from her skirt. Coffee is still warm. They sat on her porch while Ezra reloaded the crates. Samuel took the chair she had removed from its usual place and carried outside for him. Grace poured without asking how he drank it. He turned her cup handle toward her before taking his own. For a little while, they spoke of ordinary things, the dry creek above Samuel's north pasture, the early color on the aspens, and the mare that had learned to open his feed room latch. Their ease returned so naturally that Grace could almost believe nothing had changed. Samuel set his cup down. I should have thanked you better, he said, for the bread, the accounts, all of it. Grace waited. Selena will be fortunate to have you. A house with 14 rooms is work worth putting your name to. You will have people around you and wages of your own. The porch grew quiet except for Ezra setting jars into straw. You crossed the field to help me leave, Grace said. Samuel's jaw tightened. I crossed because the wagon was unsafe. That is what I said. I am trying to tell you that Kansas may give you more than this place has. This place never made the choice. He looked toward his own house. Grace rose and collected the cups. Being useful was never the same as being asked. Samuel. She carried them inside before he could offer another careful sentence. When she returned, he had placed the clean cup on the porch rail and gone back across the field. Grace lowered the lid of her traveling trunk. The rail ticket lay on top of her folded dresses. The account book rested beneath them. She fastened the straps, pressed the brass lock closed, and turned the key. Across the pasture, Samuel heard it catch just as thunder rolled over the western ridge. Clouds swallowed the afternoon sun above the foothills. Grace stepped from the barn, felt the wind turn cold against her damp palms, and saw dust lifting in narrow spirals across the pasture. "Get the team inside," she called to Ezra. "Leave the wagon where it is." A gust struck before he reached the horses. The canvas snapped upward, tore free from one rear rope, and exposed 3 rows of preserve crates. Hail rattled across the wagon bed like thrown gravel. Grace caught the hanging rope and wrapped it around her forearm. The next pull dragged her boots through the mud. Across the field, Samuel stood at his kitchen window with the peach jar in one hand. He had carried it there after hearing Grace's trunk lock, though he could not have said what returning it would accomplish. When the wagon canvas rose again, he put on his coat and ran. The pasture gate blew toward him as he reached it. He caught the top rail, but the jar struck the iron latch. Glass cracked sharply beneath his palm. Samuel expected the jar to break. Instead, a small piece chipped from the rim beneath the cloth cover, and rain streaked the dust down its sides. He pushed it deep into his coat pocket and crossed. Grace pointed toward the barn without pausing. "Take the gray mare. Ezra has the bay." Samuel obeyed. He led the mare behind the stone wall while Grace tied down the forward canvas. Ezra dragged the last loose flour sack from the wagon just as hail split the lid of its crate. "The center boxes are shifting," Samuel shouted. "Do not unload them," Grace answered. "Move the tomato crates against the left side. They are lighter than the flour." He moved where she directed. Grace crawled beneath the whipping canvas, wedged 2 preserve boxes against the heavier sacks, and threaded the torn rope through an iron ring. The repaired brace held, but rainwater ran through the wagon boards. Her traveling trunk sat beneath the leak. Grace opened it and pulled out the leather account book. Water had already darkened the cover. When she raised it, rain ran from the page edges and blurred the final column of her load figures. Samuel spread his coat across an overturned crate. Grace laid the book on it, separated the wet pages with strips torn from a flour sack, and placed a board over them before another gust could scatter the paper. Together they carried the book and the remaining records into the barn. Samuel kept the board level. Grace held the loose pages against its underside. Neither tried to speak above the storm. The canvas finally stayed down. The horses stood safely behind stone. The weighted crates remained in place, and the rain-damaged book lay open beneath the barn lantern. Some distances are measured in miles, and some in the number of times one person carries what both are afraid to name. Kindness can cross a field for years without asking payment, but how long should a heart keep making the journey alone before it is allowed to stop? Grace tested the ink with the corner of a cloth. 3 columns are gone, Samuel said. The labels remain. She took the damaged flour crate lid, copied the visible weights from its markings, and rebuilt the erased totals from memory. Samuel read each jar label while she added, their figures balanced with the original wagon weight to the pound. Ezra entered the barn dripping rainwater. Mud covered his boots nearly to the ankle. "I checked the creek road," he said. "The water is already carrying branches against the bridge." Grace closed her pencil inside the swollen book. "Will it hold until Monday?" "Not if the rain from the ridge reaches it. We either cross before the next rise or wait until the water falls. That could take a week." Samuel looked toward the loaded wagon. "When do you leave?" he asked. Ezra removed his wet hat. "Before sunrise." The original 2 days had collapsed to a single night. 10 hours remained before Grace's trunk, her account book, and every jar she had packed rolled toward Denver. Samuel touched the chipped glass inside his coat. This time there would not be another Thursday. Grace carried the soaked account book into her kitchen and set it beside the stove. Samuel followed with the loose pages pressed between 2 boards. The rain had eased to a steady tapping on the roof, but water still ran from his sleeves. He placed the chipped peach jar on the windowsill, where lantern light caught the broken edge beneath its gold cloth. Grace warmed a flat iron and laid it over clean paper atop the first warped page. Samuel found waxed thread in her sewing box, punched new holes through the softened leather binding, and stitched the spine while she restored the erased columns. Outside, Ezra moved between barn and wagon. Each trip ended with another crate settling into straw or another rope drawn tight. Samuel tied off the final stitch. It will not look the same. It does not need to. Grace opened the repaired book. The cover curled at the corners. Several pages bore brown water stains, and the new thread pulled unevenly across the spine. Still, the figures could be read. Samuel touched the page containing his settled seed accounts. "You do not have to leave on account of me," he said. Grace stopped writing. "I am not leaving to punish you. I did not say you were. You are asking me to stay without saying what I would stay for." He pulled out the chair opposite her, but remained standing behind it. "You would have your land, your house. Nothing would need to change. That is exactly what I cannot accept." The stove gave a low iron click as it cooled. Samuel looked toward the windowsill. "You are 29, Grace. I am 57. I had no right to let a young woman build her life around a man who has already buried half of his. You had no right to choose my answer for me. I thought distance was the decent thing. Distance was easy for you. I carried everything across it." Samuel lowered his hands to the chair back. "After my wife died, I decided an empty house was the price of having once had a full one. Then you kept coming, and I let myself call it neighborliness, because that asked nothing of me." Grace closed the account book. "I never brought you one loaf from pity," she said. His grip tightened on the chair. "Then why did you come?" She met his eyes. "You know why. You always did." The words left no shelter between them. Samuel took one step toward the table, then stopped beside the peach jar. "If I asked you—" Grace waited. He did not finish. She lifted the book and slid it beneath the dresses in her open trunk. "I will not answer half a question simply because the road is rising. Grace, I gave you 3 years in which nothing was leaving." Samuel picked up the jar. A streak of mud crossed the glass, and the chip caught at the cloth covering. He smoothed the fabric away from the broken place. "I do not want you to go. That is not the same as asking me to stay." The rain weakened against the roof. From the barn came the scrape of Ezra dragging the harness from its peg. Grace lowered the trunk lid between them. Samuel stood with the jar in both hands. "I need to set things right. Then decide what right means before my uncle lifts this trunk." He nodded once and walked out into the wet darkness. Grace watched him cross the pasture without a lantern. He opened the damaged gate, passed through, and pulled it closed behind him. The peach jar remained cradled against his coat. The kitchen lamp burned lower while Grace retied the surviving papers and packed her sewing box. Ezra brought the traveling trunk to the wagon. He checked the new brace, counted every crate against Grace's restored list, and led the horses from shelter. The rain stopped. Water dripped from the eaves in slower intervals. Beyond the eastern ridge, the black sky faded to charcoal. Ezra fastened the traces and hung a lantern from the wagon rail. 2 hours, he told Grace. Then we have to move. Across the pasture, Samuel's porch stood dark. The path between their houses shone with rain, and the harnessed team waited facing the road. Grace buttoned her traveling coat while Ezra carried the last flour sack into the wagon. The eastern sky had turned pale behind the wet foothills. Water gleamed in every wagon rut, and mist lay close to the pasture where Samuel's porch remained dark. Grace locked her front door, tested it once, and slipped the key into her glove. Ezra lifted her trunk by one handle. "Once this is tied down, we move." Grace took the other handle. Together they raised it toward the wagon bed. A gate struck wood across the pasture. Samuel stood at the damaged fence, pulling against a latch bent by the storm. It would not lift. He set the peach jar on the post, braced one boot against the lower rail, and forced the iron upward with both hands. The latch tore free, leaving the gate hanging from one hinge. He picked up the jar and crossed the wet field. Grace did not lower her end of the trunk. Neither did Ezra. They waited until Samuel reached the wagon, breathing hard, his trousers dark with rainwater to the knees. "I need you to stay," he said. Grace's hand remained wrapped around the trunk handle. "As what?" Samuel looked at Ezra, then back at her. "As my wife, if you will have me." The words landed plainly, but Grace did not release the trunk. "Would you be standing here if I had not packed?" "No." Samuel did not soften the answer, "and that is my shame. I waited until losing you became something I could see hitched to a wagon." Ezra lowered his end of the trunk carefully to the ground. Grace did the same. Samuel held out the jar. The glass was mud-streaked, its gold cloth torn beside the chipped rim. Beneath the string rested her folded note. "You cross that field every Thursday," he said. "You brought what I needed before I knew enough to ask. I let you do all the walking because I called my fear respect." Grace glanced toward his empty house. "And if I stay, do I go back to carrying bread and keeping your accounts while you remain grateful?" "No. I can hire a clerk. I can learn to bake badly until I improve. I am not asking for your labor." "What are you asking for?" Samuel set the jar in her trunk so both hands were empty. "I am asking you to build a home with me. We can live in your house, mine, or divide our days between them until we decide. Your land stays yours. Your work has your name. I will cross when you need me, and I will speak before silence chooses for us." He drew one breath. "I am 57. You are 29. Those are facts, Grace. They are not your answer, and I was wrong to use them as mine." Ezra stepped back toward the horses, giving her room without leaving. Grace looked at the wagon, the depot label, and the rail ticket visible inside Ezra's open coat. Selena still offered honorable work. She would not be helpless if she climbed aboard. She turned to Samuel. "I will not spend my life proving I deserve a place you have already offered. You will not have to. I will not become a visitor in the house you shared with your wife." Samuel's face tightened, but he nodded. "Then we make it ours without pretending it was never hers." Grace studied him for another moment. "Ask me again. Without Kansas standing behind me?" Samuel stepped closer, though he did not touch her. "Grace Larkin, will you marry me?" "Yes," she said, "I will." Samuel closed his eyes once. When he opened them, Grace held out her hand. He took it carefully, as if the promise required steadiness more than celebration. Ezra cleared his throat and lifted Grace's trunk away from the wagon. "These supplies still belong in Salina," he said, "but I suppose the dresses can stay in Colorado." He removed the rail ticket from his coat and returned it to Grace. She folded it once, placed it beneath the peach jar's torn cloth, and tightened the string. Ezra climbed onto the wagon seat. Samuel checked the repaired brace while Grace compared the remaining crates against her rain-warped list. The load was safe, the road was still passable, and her uncle had enough provisions to reach Denver without her. When the wagon rolled toward the creek road, Grace stood beside Samuel at the broken gate. Her trunk rested behind them on Colorado soil. "You finally crossed," she said. Samuel looked along the path her boots had made. It was my turn. The storm-broken gate was the first thing Grace and Samuel rebuilt together. Samuel brought cedar posts from his north pasture. Grace measured the opening wide enough for either wagon, not merely a person carrying a basket. They set the posts from opposite sides, tamped the wet earth level, and hung a new gate with two handles. When Samuel tested the latch, it opened toward both properties. "That seems fair," he said. "It seems practical." Grace's smile told him she understood the difference. They did not rush the joining of their lives simply because Samuel had finally rushed across the field. Grace kept her land in her name. Samuel kept his cattle account separate from her preserving business. At the same table, they opened two ledgers, compared expenses, and decided together which roof, stove, and rooms could serve them best. Grace's house had the larger pantry and the sounder kitchen. Samuel's held the ranch office, tool room, and the memories he was not required to destroy in order to make room for something new. They chose Grace's house as their home and kept his working rooms across the pasture. Each evening, Samuel closed the ranch office and crossed home before Grace lit the lamp. On market mornings, he carried her preserve crates to the wagon. On account nights, he brought his own figures to her desk and stayed until both books were closed. Nothing traveled across the field without returning in another pair of hands. Samuel carried over his blue cups, a cedar chest, and the porch chair he had once turned toward Grace's empty place. She gave the chair a permanent corner beside the stove. The rain-warped account book would no longer close flat. Grace trimmed the damaged edges, reinforced the spine with another line of wax thread, and opened it to a clean page. Samuel watched her dip the pen. "What do you call this account?" he asked. Grace wrote both their names at the top. Beneath them, she added household begun by choice. "That should keep the figures honest," she said. Their wedding was quiet. They spoke their promises without a crowd large enough to turn the moment into anyone else's judgment. Ezra sent a letter from Selena reporting that every jar had reached the boarding house unbroken except one tomato jar that had already been cracked before Denver. He enclosed payment for Grace's planning work. She deposited the money under her own name. Samuel kept his other promise less gracefully. His first loaf came from the oven hard at the edges and raw in the middle. Grace did not rescue it. She showed him how to judge the heat with his hand, then left him to mix the second dough himself. The next loaf was edible. By the first frost, the peach preserves had been eaten. Samuel cleaned the chipped jar, sanded the sharp edge smooth, and filled it with wild asters from the creek bank. He placed it beside the repaired account book on their kitchen table. Thursday morning entered through the window. Samuel poured coffee into both blue cups. Grace wrapped warm bread in the same clean towel she had once carried across the pasture. They walked outside together, each holding half of what breakfast required. Beyond the porch, new wagon tracks passed through the wide gate they had built. The narrow footpath Grace had worn alone was already softening beneath fresh grass. The field was still there, but neither of them was waiting on the other side.